and we're going to be featuring some familiar and new faces. But before we go into our program, we'd like to gather a little information about some of you. Could you identify yourself with a wave of your hand if you were in the camps during the war? When we call on you, please be sure your video is turned on and you're unmuted. Please introduce yourself, where you were living before the war, the camp you went to, and the state it was located in. And just kind of leave it short because we want to get into our whole program, but we do want to see all of you, my fellow camp residents. So let's go. How many of you were in camp? Oh my gosh. Chris, are you helping me identify everyone?
Yep, I see Alfred right there. So should we have Alfred go first? Because I see him first.
Okay, Alfred. Unmute. Yeah, there you go.
Actually, that's my first name technically. I go by Hiro, H-I-R-O. Most people know me that way. I was 4 years old when I went into Postland Camp 1 and left when I was about 7.5 years old. And we went back to the Bay Area. So I grew up in Gilroy and went to Berkeley of all places. And finally came east after my PhD in molecular biology and biochemistry. And I worked in the biotech industry in the Philadelphia region for about 30 years.
Okay, thank you, Hiro. Who's up next?
That's me.
Oh, there you are, Sam. Okay.
Hi, I'm Sam Uyehara. I was in San Francisco, age 9, and went to Pomona, and then went to Heart Mountain. There for 3 years, out of Heart Mountain to Salt Lake City for 3 years, and then finally settled back into San Francisco. Went to Berkeley, undergraduate, and UCLA graduate school, a degree in engineering, became a rocket scientist for the Boeing Company. Enjoyed my 42-year career thoroughly. And then I retired and I started talking about the camps.
Okay.
And been there ever since.
Thanks a lot, Sam. All right, who's next? Roger Ozaki.
Yes, I was, let me see, I was 5 or 6 months old when my mother, aunts, uncles, and grandparents were put in Poston from LA. And so we were there for, I guess, a couple of years. And then after camp, we moved to Cleveland, Ohio, where I think my mother and father had employment. We stayed there for a while, and then my mother and father couldn't get along, so they split up. And then my mother fell in love with another Japanese American, and he was a World War II veteran, had come back from service in China, Burma, and India, and he decided to move to Georgia. So we all moved to Georgia, down near rural Georgia, and I ended up being a farmer with him. And at one time I decided farming didn't have any future in Georgia, so I applied to go to college, University of Georgia. And thank goodness I was accepted there and was able to go to University of Georgia, get a degree there, and then eventually got a master's and then a doctorate at the University of Georgia. So I've had a long career in education, spent about 40 years as a college counselor and also a director of testing services, and finally retired about 4 years ago, and I've enjoyed every minute of it.
Thank you, Roger. Do we have any others? Chris, do you see anyone?
Hi, this is Ken Nomiyama.
Oh, Ken, great.
I was born at Tule Lake and was raised in after the war in the San Francisco Bay Area. I went to public schools in Oakland, and I went to University of California, Berkeley, and got my bachelor's and master's there. After I got my MBA, moved to the East Coast and spent the rest of my life so far in New York, and right now I'm in Newport, Rhode Island, and I've been living here with my wife and for about 15 years. I'm on the Tule Lake Committee, and so I'm very much connected with what's going on at Tule Lake, and so there's a lot of work to be done there.
Thank you, Ken. Also, I should add, Ken has been going around giving a lot of talks on the camp experience. Do we have Toshi? Did we do Toshi already?
I was born after the camps.
Oh,
So I was never, my uncle and grandfather were at
oh,
Topaz.
you weren't in the camps. I'm sorry, Toshi. Anyone else? Okay, I guess it's my turn. I was 2 months old and our family lived in Terminal Island, California when we went into the camps. And we went to Gila Bend, Arizona, where we were there for 2 years until we finally found a way to get out and move to Denver and Chicago and then back to California. And that's my story. So I hope we got everyone. And if we didn't, we'll squeeze you in at the end. But now I'll turn our program over to Ken Oye, our chapter co-president and professor of political science and data systems and society at MIT.
Thank
Ken?
you, Mark. Okay, thank you, Margie. So today's Day of Remembrance will actually proceed sort of as follows. We're going to begin with a keynote by Peter Kiang, a professor and director of Asian American Studies at UMass Boston. We circulated a copy of his law review article exploring Boston's Nisei sources and contributions to Japanese American redress movement in advance of the meeting. And he'll be talking both about what happened back then in this little corner of the United States in terms of securing or campaigning for redress, but how it happened, using archival sources actually from the chapter, and then turn to the implications for the present, including the move for reparations. Our second speaker will be Paul Watanabe, and Paul also teaches at UMass Boston, and Paul is going to be talking about a little bit on the local angles and a little bit on the larger significance, handing off to Paul Uyehara. Paul is a civil rights attorney and a Philadelphia guy. And Paul also he's worked on civil liberties and civil rights issues professionally for years. He also has a peculiar bit of upbringing. Paul's mother, Grace, was the co-chair and principal strategist behind Redress, was the face of the redress movement in the United States, operating out of Philly. And watching her step in and be such an effective leader was one of the extraordinary aspects of the story. So to go back to the program, we're going to begin with Peter, and then we're going to have commentaries by Paul and by Paul, and we'll then move to Q&A. And the question and answers will be kind of as follows. If you have a question or a comment, put it into chat and raise your hand. Christine will be serving as the producer of the talk show, and we'll be looking over the questions from chat and recognizing folks. And when she does so, please unmute and make sure that your camera is on. If you wish to pose a question or make a comment without being recorded or on camera, email me at oye@mit.edu and I'll try to read it aloud if you wish to do it that way. At the end of the program at 3:30 or so, we're going to actually have a brief musical interlude, and then we'll keep the room open for chat. The interlude is actually by Jane Minari, who is someone who grew up in the Philadelphia chapter. She actually recorded an homage to her Issei great-grandparents and Issei grandparents who were locked up. Cole Porter's Don't Fence Me in both Japanese and English. She sings opera with the Edinburgh Opera, so it's not as painful as it would be if most of us were trying to sing Cole Porter. So we'll have a little bit of that at the very end, and then we'll just keep the room open for informal discussion and socializing afterwards. So on that note, I'm going to stop the share and turn to our wonderful guest, Peter Kiang. And Peter, thank you so much for joining us on this Day of Remembrance.
Thank you, Ken and Margie, and to the chapter and everyone who has joined us today. I have not spoken publicly in a leadership role or a keynote role to a predominantly Japanese American audience, actually since 40 years ago, April 1981, at the New England premiere of the feature film Hitohata. So I'm honored to be asked, and I'm hoping that some of the both memories and the images from local archives or archives of individuals who played important roles locally will help to contribute to both a sense of the importance of the work of the chapter and the community here, and to suggest ways of contributing to the present. So I will be going through a lot of images as part of my presentation, so just bear with me for a moment while I... So I'm hoping that this is now on screen fully for you. Yeah. So yeah, with the title of the today's Day of Remembrance, I included raising a banner, and that's going to be my hidden image or symbolism throughout the talk. And it is the reference back to the phrase hitoata ageru. If those of you who remember will probably smile in recalling Mako in his role as the Issei, the Japanese immigrant from Kagoshima Prefecture, the feature character in the movie Hitohata, produced by Visual Communications, and it came out in 1980. And in this first scene where he appears, he talks about his immigrant dream of basically making it rich in America and being able to return to his village, Kagoshima, to Hitohata Agaru, raise the banner, show off his success. The film was really important, groundbreaking history making, because it was the very first Asian American produced, led, created feature film, not documentary, but a feature film, actors, actresses, expensive equipment, full length. So 1980, it is completed. Everyone was based in LA, and it was led through the organization Visual Communications, which is now 50 years old. The importance of Hitohata at the time for Asian Americans, not simply Japanese Americans, was that fact that it was the first Asian American feature film. You know, honestly, it's amazing to me that even now in 2021, so many people are still so stuck in celebrating the path-breaking representational, you know, victories of films in Hollywood or streaming online, etc. So those issues still continue today, but Hitohata was the first, and I give great credit to it, and it was really important for us in Boston. In my own role back then, from 1980 to 85, 86, I was the only staff or the main staff of an organization called the Asian American Resource Workshop, AARW. And when this is one page of an article that I wrote in 1983 that was kind of raising the banner about the AARW and our community-based model of Asian American studies and Asian American art and culture. And in this article, in the highlighted section, it's actually referencing specifically to the significance of the showing of Hitohata in Boston. this is, obviously pre-email, pre-electronic databases, all that stuff. So the way we did outreach to make sure that there was a large Japanese American audience for the premiere was we went through phone books, and we did a long late night session with all of the phone books in Massachusetts, and pulled out Japanese names and then put together a mailing list that way. When we actually did the showing in April 1981, the auditorium had 500 seats. Every seat was filled, and there were people standing and sitting on the stairs, also in the aisles. So we counted 550 people that night. And it was truly remarkable as a coming together of the local Japanese American community and the centering of Japanese American stories through film. And that led to many other initiatives related to Asian American media, as well as the Asian American Resource Workshop's involvement in the redress work. This was the time that was getting ready for the hearings around the country. And the use of hitohata in mobilizing audiences was actually part of that process in 1980 and 81. This is the only example of an archive that I'm showing today that's from my own personal files. So I have boxes and boxes of my own archives. And this is from the annual report of the Asian American Resource Workshop for 1981-82. The items that I circled are ones I was directly involved with. I mean, I was involved with all of these activities, but the ones highlighted or circled in yellow are specifically related to redress and Japanese American work. And so December 9th, 81 was actually the hearings by the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. And I'll be talking about that a bit more. The very first day of remembrance locally, it was actually sponsored by the Asian American Resource Workshop in February 1982. So today's is 39 years later, and that's a kind of wonderful reconnection, at least for me personally. What we did in that very first one was show excerpts from the LA commission hearings. So the California hearings had been done, and there were videotapes circulating as organizing and advocacy and educational resource materials. And so we had videotapes from LA and from San Francisco that we were showing and using in many, many events on college campuses, as well as this one, which was the New England Regional Social Studies Teachers Conference. So K-12 teachers, as well as college campuses, we were doing our own educational work about redress. My presentation is going to jump around a little bit, different people and places. So this is Scott Miyakawa, 1949. Scott was important for so many reasons, but one was that he actually founded the first iteration of the New England JACL in the mid-1940s. Scott was also a professor of sociology, including at UMass Boston at the end of his career and his life. Before the showing of Hitohata, I went to visit Scott Miyakawa in his office at UMass Boston. He was professor emeritus during that fall of 1980. And I wanted to just seek his wisdom and his advice about how to organize for the showing of Hitohata and how to connect it to the redress movement and anything else that he was willing to share with me. And I'm so glad that I had that opportunity to meet with him in his office. He would pass away in August 1981. He did not attend the showing of Hitohata, but he was part of the process of preparing for it. And I thank him so much. Just as a side note, on his CV, his official academic resume, it includes this line about during the war years, part of his job was to help counter the pro-evacuation propaganda of the West Coast racists. And that's a pretty great statement to have on your academic CV. And I don't know of many faculty today that would put stuff like that just out there, but much respect to Scott Miyakawa. When I was talking with Scott in his office, he also told me, and I had not realized this, that he taught the first Asian American Studies course at UMass Boston. He developed it in 1973. And that was an aspect of his work at UMass Boston that he was really proud of. And he was excited to talk to me about that. And that stuck with me from that moment on. And later on, when I began my own teaching career at UMass Boston, starting in spring 1987, the first course that I started to teach was the one that he had already created, called Asian Minorities in America. So this is a draft of the first draft of his syllabus. You know, he's still working on the content of it before teaching it for the first time. These two documents from his CV and this syllabus actually are from his archives. Sadly, his archives are not in Boston, but they are housed in the special collections at UCLA. And so jump from 1980 to 2015. In 2015, I made a trip to UCLA, partly because my son was a student there, and I owe him some credit for this paper that I put together. But during a visit in January 2015, I went to see all the Miyakawa papers. And it's an incredible collection. And, you know, these are some of the content subheadings that there's just files and files, boxes and boxes of stuff. So for example, his collection, you know, of his accounting for Japanese Americans on the East Coast, just lots and lots of this kind of material. And then his own never finished writings, Issei in New England, fantastic information put together in these pages. As early as 1906, Kawakami found that Boston Issei felt keenly their inability to become citizens. I really wish that we had seen some of that work published also. Other stuff that I found in those boxes in 2015, this really stuck out to me because I was very familiar with the New England Nisei and that story and their legacy. I was close to some of them myself, and I figured that this was the beginning invitation to the Nisei to picnic together, and it had this really compelling question at the bottom. Are we so assimilated now that we don't need even this type of dialogue? And so the organizing or the convening or the gathering of the New England Nisei is absolutely part of the story that's of Redress in Boston, and that is represented in the archives. Meanwhile, that same year, 2015, in December, Paul Watanabe, he and I were at some random meeting, and he mentioned to me of Margie's donation of her boxes of New England JACL archives. And because of my seeing the Miyakawa archives, I was really curious about this set of boxes too. And right away I asked Paul if I could just take a look. And here's some of the stuff that I found in that. And Margie, I don't know if this is your handwriting, but my guess would be that it might be. So the chronology, the earlier iteration, the formation of the New England Nisei, the creation of the second iteration of the chapter. And then we get into this key period of basically 1980-81, the main task of this new or established chapter to convince the commission to have a local hearing in Boston. So the main task of an organization. And then here's the triangulated reference to Hitohata, the showing in April 81. Several hundred attended the passing of Scott Miyakawa, the actual hearing that takes place by the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians held at Radcliffe College, but I refer to it as the Boston hearing. Other stuff in the New England JACL box, I won't say much about this, but this was evidence of the work of the New England Nisei and the Oshogatsu, the annual New Year gatherings that have been just historically so important as a structured opportunity for the Japanese American community to be present, to feel good together. And so this is 1982, the sign-in cards, and just look at these names. And in 1983, I love this stuff because I can just feel the lives and the handwritings and the people associated with this. These first 3 lines at least, Ito, Eiji Suyama, Yukabino, all veterans of the 442nd, combat veterans. So just incredible stuff that's part of the archives. Meanwhile, other things that are in the New England JACL archives, this stood out to me, this 1980 summer letter from Congressman Robert Drinan to Kei Kaneda, who is a big part of the behind the scenes of New England's contribution to redress. Basically noting to her of the passage of HR 5499, that was the legislation to establish the commission. Drinan would step down after this term in 1980. This letter from the national JACL office by this time there was a pretty strong, actively meeting coalition group in Boston, working on the hopeful Boston hearing and the larger issue of gaining redress from the Boston community. And the national chapter is basically telling us to slow down and get clear that the focus of the Boston hearing was not going to be community perspectives, community witness testimony that had already been done in the other hearings, the California hearings, the Northwest hearings, the Chicago hearing, even the New York hearing. Boston was going to be a different focus. It would have the experts testifying on the legal and constitutional issues and the reparations, redress, financial issues. So that was a hard pill for some of us to swallow because, we were community focused also, but there was an important role that the Boston hearing was going to play. So this communication kind of represents that, trying to get the Boston hearing priority just clear between the national and the local. That came from John Tataishi to the chapter president, David Sakura. Just as an example of the behind the scenes work that was going into the planning, this is to the president of Harvard University at the time, Derek Bach, coming from one of his senior staff, Kyo Morimoto, 442nd veteran, Nisei, but he was the director of the Bureau of Study Council at Harvard University. And so Kyo, in this somewhat private personal note, as well as with this official purpose, he was nudging the president of Harvard to agree to host the Boston hearing for the commission. And he's referencing Ed Brooke and Father Drinan. So these are important people in the local political world. Congressman Drinan, of course, and Senator Edward Brooke, the first African-American senator since Reconstruction at that time, and a Republican. Senator Brooke had been defeated in 1980 by Paul Tsonga, so he was no longer serving, but his stature, his importance, and his personal story as a member of the segregated 366th Combat Infantry, knowing segregation in the World War II military himself, he was appointed as a commissioner from the Senate side as a Republican. And Father Drinan was appointed by the House as a commissioner on the Democratic side. So there were 2 commissioners from Boston And Kyo is referencing the importance of both of them to President Bok to kind of leverage that aspect of who's on the commission, who wants to get this done, and to have Harvard be the host because of the stature and reputation, et cetera. So that culminates here. This is the actual flyer that we did for the hearing itself. So as you can see, panel 1, the experts talking about the legal issues around reparations and some of the economic issues. And then the panel 2, how to prevent this from happening again. So this was very different from all of the other hearings that the commission held around the country. And there's some reference to this in the redress reparations historicizing, but I don't think it gets as much attention as it really deserves. All right, so going back into the documents that are in the archives, this is an example of a letter from Eiji Suyama, who, like Kei Kaneda, wrote lots of letters throughout this period. And he's requesting one of the Harvard law professors, Archibald Cox, to present at a prior event, not for the hearings, but for an earlier event that the chapter was organizing. And in that letter, this is 1980, he's also referencing the targeting of the Iranians in the United States. And he's making that direct connection to civil liberties in the context of the Iran hostage crisis of 1979, 1980. And so we think of that in terms of the post 9/11 work, but Eiji was doing that in 1980 also, drawing out those civil liberties connections. And this was the event that he was actually preparing for in May 1980. And I think of this as really being critical before the hearing in Boston. It's a year before. And this is the combination of the local testimony, the survivors' testimony from the community, the grassroots perspectives, as well as the experts. They're combined in this single event. This is just a month after the Hitahata film showing. And I think of this as really being a critical building block before the hearing took place that the community was enabling. And Scott Miyakawa was, here still alive and one of the commenters. And, part of seeing the importance of this behind the scenes work is this report of the chapter business meeting of this time period. So this is summer 1980. The chapter is on probationary status, not a full-fledged regular chapter with national approval yet. But the work is dealing with the civil rights issues, and interestingly, making the connections with other Asian groups. So this was very much a part of the view of the emerging new version of the chapter. And this is because of the Asian American Resource Workshop, that kind of coalition building and collaboration, as well as other issues going on, such as the trade war, Japan import stuff. Vincent Chin's killing would be 2 years later. The resettlement of Southeast Asian refugees and the way that the New England Nisei were considering the needs of the Southeast Asian refugee population as part of what they could be supporting more directly. So this very thoughtful view, I think, is evidenced here in the archives. And then the work on the commission's hearing preparation and all of that. After the hearing is over, the work continues, and redress doesn't occur until 1988. But this is 1984, another letter from Kei Kaneda to Senator Kennedy, just urging his continued vigilance and advocacy for the Civil Liberties Act. At this time, it's referencing 1983, 84, but it took a few more years after that. So the chapter has a very good paragraph that describes this period of time. And I think, on your own webpage, this puts it in very clear perspective. But what I tried to share with you today is some of the work behind the scenes. And with the idea of raising the banner and connecting it actually to 2021, 2020 now, you know, part of the issue now is the xenophobic anti-Asian violence. This is from March 2020. This is the day before the state goes into quarantine lockdown. And this is a rally against anti-Asian violence on the steps of the State House, led by the Massachusetts Asian American Commission. Just as a footnote, this person, the executive director at that time, was one of our UMass Boston alums. The current executive director now in 2021 is this person, who is also, she's currently a UMass Boston grad student. But this anti-Asian violence work of the current moment with the pandemic since a year ago, and still now intensifying even further. I mean, there's certainly a role for the chapter and for Japanese American perspectives from World War II, and the articulation of the consequences of that period on health, mental health, and everything else. That's pretty straightforward to make that case. But then finally, just last month, HR 40, which is the legislation to establish the commission to explore reparations for African Americans and their enslavement, went through. And circled in yellow are the Massachusetts representatives. And you can get a sense of that. Just 10 days ago, the first hearing from the Judiciary Committee took place on HR 40. And the chair of the NCRR was one of the people giving testimony for that. And I have clips of this on video that I can show if there is time. So I want to just finish by saying that in terms of the current work now and looking back, I think what I'm trying to argue here is, number one, the work of the Boston or New England Japanese American community and the coalition around Redress, I don't think it was ever really properly recognized or respected as part of the national story. It does not appear in the national write-ups of the story. But I think there was a unique contribution that we made from here. I think secondly, in the current moment, there are things that can still be done, drawing from those lessons. Certainly one is for Japanese Americans to be writing to their Massachusetts representatives right now in support of HR 40. And those letters would have, I think, powerful meaning, whether our Massachusetts delegation are co-sponsors of HR 40 or not. So that's something to consider maybe for the chapter. I think thirdly, in the archives, and I don't think it's comprehensively collected in the archives, but certainly there ought to be some way of pulling out all of the testimony that was given at the Boston hearing, because the point of that was to draw on other examples that would really make the case plausible, realistic, acceptable for reparations, as well as the apology and the education fund, et cetera. That's important to make real in the current moment with African American reparations. So just as an example, this is in the New England JACL archives, this testimony from Ralph Johnson from that day back in 81. And he's arguing for the Indian Claims Commission Act as something to draw on. And I just wonder if there's in both the testimony that was given in 1981, if any of that has relevance to the current hearings or the current study, the role of the current HR 40 Commission, and if the record from the Japanese American hearings should be brought more fully and comprehensively into the current moment. So yeah, just to wrap up with final images, this is East Boston, 1942. The population is so small here, but the sentiment was, pretty intense here, regardless. And the early Nisei who were here, I mean, their presence is undeniable, but certainly not talked about or recorded much or given much attention to. But in Asian American studies, it's something that we honor. And this is just a fact. The East Coast does have a history that is distinctive and should be recognized further. And the raising of the banner, in the film Hitohata, Mako never gets to return to his home village of Kagoshima to raise his glory banner of being a successful, rich immigrant. But he does raise a banner toward the end of the movie, which is to defend Little Tokyo in Los Angeles against evictions and displacement, another round of displacement due to land takeovers and gentrification. And so the raising of the banner is not just to be full of pride, but it is to draw attention and to mobilize for support. So I think there's still a role for us in New England who were involved with the redress reparations work here to do that. And that was very much my intention in pulling together this article, both to honor what was done in the past and also to say that there are lessons that can be shared for now. So thank you for your attention. Sorry, I'm all over the place all the time, but I'm proud of the work that was done. And I certainly think that the chapter's role, along with New England Nisei and others, deserves much more credit and that there's still more work to be done.
Peter, thank you so much for the presentation. The challenge that we face now is very great indeed. We're going to turn to Paul Watanabe and then Paul Uyehara for comments. And why don't we start with Paul? Thank you again, Peter.
Well, I want to say thank you to the, sorry, am I?
You're fine, Paul.
Oh, yeah. Great. I'm usually muted. They usually begin by telling me I'm muted.
Paul, actually, there's a case of a professor who went for 90 minutes muted. And his class didn't bother to tell him. Please go ahead, Paul.
I want to thank my longstanding colleague, Peter Kiang, for helping raise the banner about New England's contribution to the redress effort. He's really done us a wonderful privilege by his article and by his talk today. I want to thank Ken and Margie and everybody connected with New England JACL. It's been a wonderful affiliation. And I see people around the country that I've been working with at various times. I see the people in Philadelphia who I've given talks there before. I see Sam, who we had come in the New England area a few years ago to talk about his experience. So I'm very glad to have all of these people join us today for this Day of Remembrance celebration. And I want to focus just for a minute on the legacy and the continuing influence of the redress and reparations movement for Japanese Americans and for others. And Peter sort of really forecast some of my thoughts here, and we didn't really did this in cahoots with each other. We did it separately, but we really came out on the same place in terms of some of our ideas about the legacy of the redress movement. First of all, the testimony that was utilized during the redress movement changed the narrative of the Japanese American incarceration. I think that's a critical aspect of the redress movement itself that has to be recognized. Up at the time of the hearings and so forth about the two principal vehicles by which people knew in print about the Japanese American experience were Bill Hosokawa's book, The Nisei, The Quiet Americans, notice the title. And secondly, a piece by a famous sociologist, William Peterson, called Success Story, Japanese American Style, in which the term model minority is actually coined for the first time. And both of these narratives about the incarceration were ones essentially that assuredly the incarceration was a bad thing for Japanese Americans and probably wrong for the government to have done so. But Japanese Americans sort of with grit and a sense of gaman and so forth and shikata ganai went ahead and sort of they sort of persevered and then succeeded, sort of unscathed from the internment experience. That they really, by grit and perseverance, really did go along with effectively and survived the internment as best they could, and ended up being quite successful ultimately in terms of educational attainment and income and prestige, et cetera. And that was the story of the internment for the longest period of time. But a principle of reparations work is that efforts to do reparations, and that is to repair, must follow an accounting, a truth and reconciliation effort effectively. And that's really what, with President Carter's assistance and the Congress's decision to create a commission in the late 1970s, around 1980, that it opened the possibility, the door for something like a truth commission, and hearings themselves providing an opportunity for there to be an accounting of the truth of the internment experience. And that's a critical role that the reparations process, and it's a necessary role to tell the full story. Before you have every repair, you got to have an accounting. And the story that emerged from the hearings was a story of trauma. It was a story of fear, of pain, and of despair, and of resistance, alongside that of the other elements as well. I'm not saying that one replaced the other, but these other elements of trauma and fear and lingering pain and resistance were not part of the original narrative, and they emerged from the stories that were told. The books and films since that period of time began to talk about, and it opened the door for people to talk about the ways in which the internment had this impact on people. Setsuko Ina's both her book and her documentary film "Children of the Camps" emerged. The Amori sisters' accounts in "Rabbit of the Moon," the documentary film "Family Gathering," and Frank Abe's "Conscious in the Constitution," which talked about the resistors for the first time. And even more recently, the film which the New England chapter helped to premiere about a year ago at the Boston Film Festival, "Alternative Facts: The Lies of Executive Order 9066." All of these are in the tradition of telling the truth, of truth-telling before there can be any form of reparations or repair. And another principle is not just in telling the story in reparations work, but who is telling the story, and that is empowering those who were the most directly impacted to be the sources of the truth. And in that regard, once again, the reparations process, even though not fully realized, as Peter's pointed out in Boston, there were opportunities still for people to tell their story, not only to the public, but even to their own families to some degree. And these stories throughout the country were really something that had the most profound impact, I think, on turning the political system to ultimately accept the decisions made and represent the Civil Liberties Act in 1988. And so it's the stories of these individuals and the idea of the sources of the truth coming from the voices of those most affected is another important legacy of the redress experience. And we use that observation as a way to talk about the way in which the Japanese American reparations movement has and continues to have influence on other movements. Peter talked, for example, for the past 42 years, every Congress in the last 42 years, there's been legislation filed initially by Representative John Conyers of Michigan, HR 40, calling for a commission to study reparations proposals for African Americans. And after John Conyers passing a couple of years ago, that torch has been picked up by Sheila Jackson Lee, an African American woman, Congresswoman from Texas. And that has not changed since. But notice when John Conyers began his effort, he began it in 1989. And it's not just by chance that he began it in 1989. It's because he saw what happened with the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 with the Japanese American reparations movement that John Conyers said he wanted to look at that same, employing the same lens and possibility, looking at issues including the Black reparations as well. So there was a direct link between what was done in terms of the Japanese American reparations movement that had ultimately been culminated in the 1988 Civil Liberties Act and his decision beginning in 1989 this 42-year effort to try to get a commission to study the possibility of Black reparations in the United States. I was asked recently to address at a recent conference the efforts for Japanese American, the connection between the effort for Japanese American reparations and reparations related to the lynching of Black Americans. In this conference, this meeting included many people much more famous than myself. Ta-Nehisi Coates, for example, Angela Davis, and Representative Lee herself participated in this conference. And I was asked to talk about the linkages between what was happened in the Japanese American reparations experience and what was happening on these fronts. And in this respect, one thing that became very clear to me, the individual stories, the way in which Japanese Americans talked about their experience is going to be and will be crucial in the effort for this portion of reparations, the reparations for the lynching of Black Americans. For there to be reparations on that front, it'll be critical for their survivors and people impacted that to tell their story as Japanese Americans did in terms of their thing. And I'm going to try, I'm not sure I can do this, but I have a little clip from some of these stories on, but I don't know if this, am I sharing it? Is this being shared? Sorry.
It's not being shared yet. Christine, is Paul a co-host?
He is.
Okay.
All right, I'm probably not gonna be able to do this. Anyway, I had a clip, sorry. I had a clip of someone who was a daughter of someone who had been lynched in the United States and telling the ongoing trauma of the story and how her three of her brothers, 12, 14, and 16 are the ones who found their father hanging from a tree, shot 6 times, hands behind his back, etc. And that person had been listed officially as committing suicide. And the trauma that this had over their family and her family was very similar to the kinds of stories that were told in terms of the experience of the Japanese American incarceration in World War II. So the power of those telling stories along those lines is critical to this exercise. And it's also important not only in telling the stories of the Black lynching, but also talking about lynching in general, telling those stories. Because of course, when we talk about lynching in the United States, it is simply not one that simply affected only Black Americans. And part of their education and the shared learning about these things is to understand, for example, the 1871 lynching in Los Angeles, the largest, argued to be the largest single episode of lynching in the United States, when 18 Chinese Americans were lynched in Los Angeles in 1871. And I was going to have a little clip here to talk about the 1871 Chinese lynching, but I'm probably going to run into the same technical lack of expertise that I have here. Ken was going to say that he gets always laughed at being at MIT and supposedly they're going to be masters of all this stuff. I think this is one of our problems. My problems as a Asian American in general, supposedly supposed to be good at this stuff. And I am sort of terrible at technology. So I'm sorry about that. So I can't even put up a video, but I was going to show a video on the 1871 lynching of Chinese Americans in the LA massacre of 1871. And here's a link now, and walking around the area of Los Angeles, really by where Little Tokyo is and by the government and the government built the city hall and so forth, where in fact the lynchings took place in those neighborhoods, in those parts of Chinatown. In the film I was going to show, the little clip, it was important because there's been a few little documentary films made about the 1871 massacre, but this one was interesting. This is a film done by high school students who are studying, discovering this. And the fact is that this is an opportunity again for young people as well to dig into these experiences and to talk about them. So let me tell you, let me end by just saying that, there are other legacies as well of the redress experience, including those in New England. And one of the very positive ones is the creation of the Nisei Student Relocation Commemorative Fund, of which I have the joy today of being the president of the Nisei Student Relocation Commemorative Fund. Peter had talked about how many of the people who were Japanese Americans after the the reparations, the redress funds were distributed to people within the Japanese in the New England area, that they had a picnic in New Hampshire. Some of these people who are part of the Japanese American community, not a large community in 1980 something, 88 or 89 when they got these funds. They decided to meet together and have a picnic as Japanese tend to do. We did so when I was growing up, and many of the older Japanese Americans must remember the picnics they had in their community. And this was the start of a gathering which ultimately led to the Oshogatsu, but the creation of what was called the New England Kenjin Kai. And this group decided that many of them had just received their reparations checks and wondered what they should do with it. And what they did with their reparations checks is instead of they said we ought to, instead of using the money for ourselves, why don't we see if we can create some sort of fund to help somebody else create a scholarship fund or somebody to help somebody else with the money that we're being given by the government, the $20,000. And of course, initially the talk was creating a scholarship fund for Japanese American students because that's who they were. And then the talk began to change a bit. Somebody said, you know, a lot of the Japanese American students are doing quite well, you know, economically, and they've come from families that have relatively high incomes and so forth. And they said for themselves that maybe the best thing to do is let's look around and see. And many of these people had come to New England because they had been part of the Nisei Student Relocation Program, where kids who were in college at the time who were thrown in concentration camps by the United States government got assistance by private entities outside of the government who said, look, why don't we give these kids a chance to continue their education during the war outside of the West Coast, of course, which would not welcome them. But let's see if we can find universities in the Midwest and the East, for example, who might take them. And if we can get them admitted, get their tuition paid for, would the government allow us to have these kids leave the camps and continue their education? And the government said, yes, they would. And this led to over 4,000 students being allowed to leave their camps and go to college in places like the Midwest and the East, and places like Bates College and Boston University. Not like Harvard and MIT, for example, which refused to accept these students, but other places that did. And this became the foundation of much of the New England Japanese American community. And so when these people got together and said, what can we do with these funds and who can we help out with scholarships? They looked around and they said, who can we help out who were suffering because of the war like we did? And at the time, it was largely the boat people who were coming over from Vietnam and who were coming from Southeast Asia as the consequence of the Vietnam War. And they said to themselves, you know, this is a population of people who are being stung by the impact of war and could use some help by some outsiders as we were helped. And to this day, the Nisei Student Relocation Commemorative Fund gives its scholarships each year to high school students who are the students come from families that are former refugees from the Southeast Asian War. And we have done this now. We've given over $1 million of assistance now to students since that early picnic that took place some 30 years ago in New England. And that's one of the positive legacies of the redress and reparations efforts as well. And finally, let me just say a few minutes about this archive that Peter looked at. You know, it's a contribution really by your organization, New England JACL, and it's a rich one, as Peter pointed out. We put together a user guide, or I had an undergraduate student put together a user guide. It's 178 pages, 178 pages of entries of what's in the archive. It's 5 archive boxes, which if anybody knows archive, 5 double archive boxes. So it's a fairly large collection. And we have a user guide that's prepared. I had a undergraduate student go through and prepare a user guide. And you can use this particular archive, and it just shows you this kind of research that UN can do, in this case, into the history of the New England JACL, its experience and so forth. But things like the Oshogatsu, the New England Kenjin Kai Oshogatsu, which is the largest event every year for Japanese Americans in New England, and other sorts of things and activities that have taken place within the community. It's a rich resource, and Peter has just given you a flavor, and that's really part of the purpose I wrote this thing. Gave you a flavor of what can be done if one digs into these sorts of resources. So thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Peter. We're going to turn to Paul Uyehara now, and I wanted to just make a quick note that if we look over the last two talks, we heard a lot about people telling their stories and the emotional impact that is part of securing redress or reparations. We also heard people talking about the legal aspects, that hearing in Boston that went over precedent and Constitution and statutes. And Paul, our next speaker, is someone who first welcome to New England, if only virtually, Paul. We also go back a ways to JACL picnics of all things, and I was kind of thinking about that as Paul was speaking. But Paul is taking us both back and ahead, looking back to redress from a front row seat as a child, and to the present as a civil rights attorney with intense familiarity with current crises and problems. Paul, thank you for making the long journey up to New England.
Thanks a lot, Ken. And I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to see everybody that joined in today. I do think it's a little curious that I was asked to present here, but as Ken just mentioned, we go back a little ways because I think we were both born into the JACL in the Philadelphia chapter. Our families have known each other for a long time. And because I try to tell them I don't really have much to contribute to this program, and I know somebody who could give you a lot more substantive information, but it didn't work. And at the same time, listening to Peter and Paul talk, I was also struck by the extent to which there are various community connections between many of us and this whole issue, as well as issues today. I looked at Peter's article, and when he showed us his documents today, he made several references to Kay Kaneda. And Kay is my aunt. She was the younger sister of my mother. And as Peter explained, she was the chapter redress coordinator. And the other thing is, as I was thinking about what to say today, I realized there were some other kind of odd coincidental connections to things. I just got an email at my office on Tuesday. I work for the Justice Department in the Civil Rights Division. And we got an email from the new appointee that at this point, at least, is in charge of the division, pending confirmation of the new Assistant Attorney General, Kristen Clark. And she was writing to remind us about the Office of Redress Administration, which was an office within the Civil Rights Division from 1988 to 98 that was set up to actually disperse the redress payments to those who are eligible. And she was talking about how they're preparing a commemorative program, and shared that a number of oral interviews have been prepared, which reminded me that, for example, a friend that I know from work, because she's still there, was on the staff there, Martha, who's also a JACL DC chapter member. In any event, so to talk about my mother's role, the difficult thing is that I don't really know that much about it. From personal experience, it's more from what I've heard from others. And it's partly have a good excuse for that, which is that at the time, which we're going back to the mid 80s, I was kind of busy because I was not only working, but I was going to law school at night. And although I was born into the JACL, there was a period of time when I was not at all active in JACL. And that was kind of smack in the middle of that. So I was not a good son. I did not appreciate the contributions that my mother was making to the whole effort until well after it had concluded. But she had early on, served as the redress coordinator for the Eastern District Council of JACL. And, her view was we needed to make sure that people were organized all up and down the East Coast in all the states to start the lobbying effort. And then she retired. And I just realized last night that at that point in time, she was pretty much the same age that I am now. And she had just retired, and then she was recruited by the Legislative Education Committee to serve as executive director. And that would have been, I don't know, 1984 or 85. And at that point, they were trying to raise money. They didn't have a whole lot of money. She had just started collecting Social Security, and at that time, it didn't make sense for her to draw a salary, and they didn't really have the money anyway. So she kind of volunteered, and she started doing the work. And again, curious connection. She lived at that time in Westchester, Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia. My dad would drive her to Wilmington and drop her off at the Amtrak station, the same one that Joe Biden used. And she would take the train down to DC and stay there for 3 nights doing her work with LEC. And then she would come back. My dad would pick her up. And then she would work. She was pretty much working 7 days a week when this stuff got rolling. And I only mention that because for the last 13 years or so, I've been going back and forth to Washington from Philadelphia on Amtrak, which is kind of curious at this point. But the purpose of the LEC, which, by the way, organizationally had been set up by JACL as a separate entity because it was going to be focused on lobbying work. And it would have created a legal problem for JACL because of its 501c3 status. So the LEC was created as a 501c4 to kind of house the overtly political lobbying work that needed to be done with Redress at that point. And her job was to organize JACL through its chapters, to do the lobbying, to reach out for each member to reach out to their representatives in Congress, to find connections they had to districts where members did not live, whether it was through their church or their professional organizations, to get those groups to lobby their representatives to support the effort. So she was quite accomplished as a fundraiser, a cheerleader, a kind of field general, and whipping together the troops to do the lobbying for several years, as it turned out. Although when she was recruited, I think she was told it was probably take 5 or 6 months of her time, after which she could go back to retirement. I also thought it was interesting. I mentioned that my dad would drive her and pick her up. But I think the role that she played in the LEC is also interesting just from a gender perspective for her at that period in time, and also for what she had done prior to that in her career. It's something that younger members today may not really fully appreciate. And and even today, we can say within JACL that although there are plenty of women who are leaders, we've still only had two women serve as national president of JACL. The first one was from the New York chapter, Lillian Kimura, and my mom had served as her campaign chair in her successful, campaign. But anyway, so my point about raising my father's role was while she was running around and working 7 days a week and converted a room in the house into her office with her copier and fax machine and typewriter, where she was churning out weekly newsletters and instructions to everybody about what they were supposed to do. He was basically facilitating her work, cooking, housekeeping, and driving, and so on, without any complaint. And after the redress was successful, sorry. We JACL had to move on and continue with other aspects of the work, which included the creation of the JACL Legacy Fund. And she, at that point, was put in charge of that effort and helped, major fundraising campaign, which was connected in part to asking Nisei to donate their redress payments back to JACL for the good of the organization and the community. I could comment on other things about stands that JACL has taken subsequently that I think kind of flow out of the legacy of the success of the redress campaign. But I think it would take too long to go through that, and maybe we can touch on that in some of the question and answer. The other thing that and same thing, Ken was talking about discussing some of the issues with the current legislation in terms of reparations and so forth, but I think that's probably left better for the general discussion as well. I think I'm just going to leave it right there, and we can hit on some of these things with the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. What we're going to do now is we're going to turn to questions and answers as indicated at the outset. Please enter questions in chat and raise your hand, either metaphorically or digitally. And what we're going to do is try to call on people as questions are coming in. Chris, do you have any points on the technology?
No, I think if people don't want to write the questions, if they've just raised your hands and wave would be another way.
What we'll do is we're going to look at the room and look for your waving hands. And so if you don't want to type them out and go with that method, we'll use the old-fashioned approach. Let's see. So Chris, you're the talk show producer at this point.
Okay, seems like we have a comment from Andy. Maybe you can share it with the group if you can unmute yourself, Andy.
Chris, thank you. That was very quick. So I just put that in the chat. I'm actually just observing today from the Bay Area in California. So I'm very unfamiliar. And to be honest with you, until I even found out about your chapter this morning on the DOR national calendar, I wasn't really aware that there was kind of a longstanding chapter in New England, or that there may have been Japanese Americans who were maybe even interned from the East Coast. But if they were interned, they probably would have been sent to West Coast locations. So I'm wondering, among all of you and not just the panelists today, are you aware of any books on the history of Japanese Americans on the East Coast? I will start by saying that I found out about one about very early Japanese settlers in Florida. I make a reference to the author's book talk last year. And that book, because it's about Florida, it somehow also has a lot of references to Japanese Americans in New York, some of whom came to Florida at that time. I'll share a few other books later, but for now, I appreciate the chance to just say something briefly.
Thank you, Andy. Maybe Paul, did you want to comment on that? We had Keiko also write a few book recommendations in the chat.
Yeah, I was sort of knocked out for the first part of the question, but as I gather, the Andy wanted to know, were any people from New England area interned? Is that the question?
Part of it, right? And go ahead.
They were outside of the zone, so they were not formally part of the mass internment. However, Boston did, at the East Boston Immigration Station, have a Justice Department facility where some Japanese nationals, as well as Germans and Italians, were actually held during the war. And this is a little known part of Boston history, that the East Boston Immigration Center, which is the art form of the Ellis Island, if you will, here in Boston, was actually a site during the war of Japanese Americans who were placed in, along with other German and Italian nationals in that context. As I pointed out, the actual census in 1940 showed that in Massachusetts, there are only 158 Japanese Americans.
I'm going to recommend that we take the bibliographic component and do that one through email and chat, and kind of turn to questions that are either looking back at Redress or looking at the current issues now. It was probably the most improbable political victory in the history of American politics to actually pull that off, getting Congress to pass the bill, getting Ronald Reagan to sign it. And when you look at the calls for reparations today, there are daunting hurdles to be sure, but at the same time, pulling together and how to pull together to pull off improbable victories is that story of the past and the hope for the future. Are there questions for our panelists at this time?
Can I just say, in terms of Andy asked for any bibliographic material, and the best piece that I've seen is an unpublished piece, and it's the one that Peter referred to, which is the manuscript that Scott Miyakawa was developing called the East Coast Issei. So it was going to be a study of exactly what he was interested in looking at, and it's unpublished as of now.
So one thought looking back at the Redress campaign and what made it so special, it really was a combination of grassroots activists, lawyers, lobbyists. It was Grace Uyehara, a social worker, mobilizing lots and lots of people to be writing letters and leaning hard. It was also big campaign donors from growers, for example, going to the Congress people that they had cultivated for years and saying, I have a favor, would you please look after this? It was also a moral pitch. And the interesting part of this is when you look at some of the guys in the Reagan administration, or even some of the conservative Republicans in Congress, their natural inclination was not towards ACLU type civil liberties, civil rights, social worker types. And at the same time, they were responsive to pitches on other grounds. One of the pitches was actually on pure issues of conscience. It was injustice, and you don't let injustice stand. And back in those days, there were actually some principled conservatives that you could pitch to on those grounds. And that was part of it. There was another pitch, which no one talks about in JACL circles, but it ran along the following lines. Japanese Americans are natural conservatives, family values, hard work, all that stuff. This was sort of playing off of model minorities and doubling down. And you Republicans, if you ever want to get Japanese American votes in California, and you lean against this, President Reagan, members of Congress, you're going to lose us forever. So there was a Straussian conservative, who I'll leave anonymous for now, who was doing, in a sense, the inside job as the lobbying and other activities were taking place externally. But that was, again, part of the pitch. But if you look and say, well, that's a weird coalition from real progressives to a conservative Republican Straussian, it was an improbable coalition, but it probably took all of that to be able to pull off the victory. And I'm just mentioning that to provide a context for the bits and pieces of the history that we've heard from our speakers today. First, corrections, if I got that wrong, to those of you that have looked at this more carefully than I have, or lived it. And then maybe we could even move explicitly to the current topics of reparations and the like. I'm noting that we are running a little bit later, but I think we can run a little bit over time on a Saturday afternoon. First, any corrections to that, let's call it.
1988 being a presidential election year certainly helped, because there was an assumption that George Bush was, believe it or not, places like California in 1980 were still considered competitive. And George Bush was convinced by some people, I think they must have had their hands behind their back and they had their fingers crossed behind their back, because they claimed that Asian Americans and Japanese Americans might be critical in winning the California vote, which they really weren't. But and so Ronald Reagan was convinced that to help out George Bush in the 1988 presidential election, it might be a good idea to sign it. Because Reagan's initial response was, it's not a bad idea, but it costs too much money. And that was the original opposition to the legislation, and it delayed the legislation ultimately. The price tag ultimately got paid by George Bush and his administration later on. But, you know, so people are going to say that that was a wise political move, but it really was, as Ken sort of implies, really basic politics which helped get it passed. And the idea of going to the Congress and trying to get some legislation passed, that was the big battle within the community, because initially many people within the community said that we should not pursue a legislative strategy, that we should pursue a strategy in the courts. And that was the critical decision that was made, to go through Congress rather than to go through the courts. Because the feeling was, if you went to the courts, you might be able to get some larger settlements than just the $20,000 that was ultimately given. And the other proviso of the $20,000, while you were allowed to have the $20,000, the other part of it was that if you accepted the $20,000, you could not sue the government in court for any further redress of grievances.
You know, Ken, I see that Naoko has a question that might kind of loop into what you're discussing right now. Naoko Shibusawa, maybe you want to unmute yourself and.
It's just kind of a question I've had for years. When I was dissertating back in the 1990s and I first started to come to the New England JACL events, I had heard someone say with pride, that we in the New England area are more progressive, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess this is a question kind of going off of like Peter's research and the archives, is like, how distinctive are the New England JACL, New England Japanese Americans, opposed to other Japanese Americans elsewhere? Is there a sense of, like, at that time, it seemed like it was a point of pride, and of course, it's just a generalization, but I was wondering if there's anything that's distinctive perhaps about the New England JACL versus like other JACLs in terms of like social justice sort of, programs, et cetera, that had been done, just like the scholarship program that was started by the folks here.
Also, I think I can answer that question, because you refer to a showing of Rabbit in the Moon at the MFA. I was the speaker at that showing.
I remember.
And at the time, I had just started getting more involved with JACL. And ours is a very small chapter, very small in comparison to everything in California. And I had moved here from California, so I know the difference. And at the time, we couldn't even afford to pay our dues to national. We had no money. And as a result, we were considered a maverick chapter. And I think we took pride in it because we were an active chapter, but we were doing the work, as you could see from Peter's reporting, but we were not a full-fledged member because we couldn't afford to pay their dues. I think I was very impressed with everything I was seeing happening with such a small chapter in comparison to what I experienced from San Francisco, where we had a chapter with 1,000 members, over 1,000 members. And, and the difference between the two really impressed me. And maybe it was my own pride in what I saw happening here and knew what they were doing that I made that statement. I didn't mean to make it sound like we were better than anyone, but we were very proud of ourselves because we were doing a lot with what we had. So
thank you. Yeah, but Margie, it wasn't just you who was saying that. It was somebody else who said it. It wasn't you.
Someone else?
Yeah, I think it was Jean Hibino or somebody else. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Maybe I seeded the audience with someone to say it, so I didn't have to say it.
Let me ask a follow-up to that. And it was one of the things that I was thinking about earlier, that National JACL in 1994 at the convention adopted a resolution favoring gay marriage, and which was an extremely radical position to take in 1994. JACL was the first not gay organization to take a position like that. Certainly did so before a lot of other civil rights organizations. So one litmus test would be for Margie and the other longtime New England chapter members is, did you lose members after that resolution was passed? Because I can remember in Philadelphia that I said I had left JACL for a while when I was in college and so on. I came back into the chapter on the board in the early 90s. And I remember one of the first meetings I went to was really fun to me because there was this big fight over this resolution. And our chapter lost a lot of members. And I know National lost a lot of members because of that position. So if you didn't lose too many, that would tell you something.
We didn't lose a single member.
There you go.
We started small. Well, to answer that question, all right, if I look at JACL and whether it was healthy or not, growing or not, active or not, Redress infused the whole organization with a sense of energy and purpose. A lot of Sansei that had been kind of dropping out or working on broader Asian American issues came back in on Redress. That was certainly true of me. I mean, I remember going to meetings. I was in the Middle Atlantic states back then, going to meetings in New Jersey where people were trying to plot strategy and hearing shockingly honest conversations about how to try to win. But it was a mixture of things going on. And, you'd have someone saying, I gave a lot of money to that son of a bitch. Let me handle them. Grace, you stay away. If you get people like your son knocking on that congressman's door, will lose votes. But that kind of practical focus, not just on Redress, but Redress was clearly the issue that brought a lot of people back in. The other period is actually 9/11. And our chapter expanded dramatically meaning, like by 5 people in the period after 9/11. But it was because, okay, what's the sense of purpose? Someone has to be speaking out for the folks that are getting crushed. And that was true not just in New England, that was true in almost all of the chapters on the East Coast. I don't know about the West Coast that much, but lots of events with Arab Americans and Muslims who were being persecuted. And I think that's not that unusual, frankly. There has to be a larger sense of mission. And the organization itself obviously began protecting Japanese Americans, narrowly defined, but it's an Asian American organization with attention to a broad range of civil liberties issues today, at least.
Yeah. if I can add to that, I did try to hint at that at the beginning of my talk, that the relationship to the Boston area Asian American movement work, the JACL chapter was connected to that and very much mutually influencing each other. I also think that because the chapter was so small, that the influence, for example, of someone like Kay, who was a social worker also, like your mom, Paul, that just that line of work was part of the shaping of influential individual leaders. And I also think the influence of American Friends Service Committee on individuals who were active in the local chapter had greater weight than it might have had in other chapters regionally. And also finally, I think for some of the Nisei, in the New England Nisei network, at least, like the Hibinos, their kids were in California in part as leaders of the NCRR. So there was, that intergenerational influence from kids who were involved in the really progressive grassroots organizing aspects of the redress work that was influencing the households back in New England as well. So I think there's a few different explanations for that quality, but thank goodness that that was the case, and that made a lot of things much easier to happen in New England.
Paul, you're muted.
Okay, other questions?
Can I make just a statement here that Peter had mentioned earlier about during the Hito Hara, how he had gone through the telephone books to find Japanese names, presumably to invite them to that opening. And the same thing for the first Oshogatsu, they did the same thing. And for this Kenjin-kai picnic, Nobu Hibino did exactly the same thing. And I think today, I have a student doing a report on the first Asian American women legislators in Massachusetts. And the last name of one of them is Wynn, so that's obviously an Asian name, but the other ones are Howard, Robinson, Vanderhoeven, and Oral. That's the last names of the other four. And two of them are Japanese American, partly Japanese American. The Vanderhoeven and the Oral are Japanese American. So you would not have found them by looking their names up in any phone book. Actually, today there's no phone book to look them up in either, but it just shows you how things have changed.
Yeah,